The wind came low and lonesome across the tall prairie grass, bending it like waves on a green-gold sea. And somewhere beneath that endless whisper of the frontier, a baby was crying, not the fussy whimper of a spoiled child, but the thin, desperate wail of hunger that clawed at the sky and seemed to shame the sun itself. The woman kneeling in the grass held the child close to her chest, her dress torn by travel, her boots worn thin, her lips cracked from thirst. She had not eaten proper in 2 days, and her milk had near dried up from fear and exhaustion. Her name was Clara May Whitmore, once the wife of a railroad worker, now a widow left with nothing but a wagon that broke an axle, 30 miles back, and a future that looked as empty as the prairie horizon. She tried to hush the baby, rocking him gently, whispering promises she could not keep. "Hush now, Caleb. Mama's here. Mama's trying." But the child's cry rose sharper, carried by the wind like a signal fire of sorrow. It was that cry that reached the ears of a drifter riding slow along the ridge above the grassland. A tall cowboy with dust ground into his coat seams and years written deep into his eyes. Folks called him Wade Callahan, though some towns knew him by other names, and none knew him well. He had no ranch to claim, no family to ride back to, only a worn saddle, a steady horse named Rusty, and a habit of keeping to himself. But that cry stopped him cold. He pulled his horse to a halt, head tilting, listening hard as the wind shifted again. And when the sound came once more, thin, trembling, and heartbreaking, he turned Rusty toward it without another thought. As he crested the low swell and saw the woman crouched in the grass, clutching the squalling child like the world meant to steal him, he felt something twist in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Clara looked up at the shadow falling over her and stiffened, fear flashing through her tired eyes. A lone cowboy in these parts could mean trouble just as easy as salvation. Wade swung down slow from his saddle, hands open where she could see him. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough from dust and silence. "I heard the little one crying clear across the ridge." She swallowed hard. "He's hungry," she managed, shame trembling in her words. I ain't got nothing left to give him." Wade's gaze dropped to the baby, tiny fists clenched, face red with effort, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached behind his saddle and untied a small cloth bundle. It wasn't much, half a loaf of hard bread, a strip of jerky, and a small tin cup, but it was near all he had. He crouched and set it down careful in the grass. "It ain't fancy," he muttered, "but it'll hold you over." Clara stared like he'd laid down a bar of gold. "I can't take your food, mister. You look near as starved as me." Wade gave the faintest shrug. "I've gone hungry before. Ain't the first time. But that boy there, he ain't learned how yet." The baby's cry hitched, weakening now from exhaustion, and that sound made Wade move quicker. He pulled off his heavy coat, lined with wool, stitched and restitched through harsh winters, and draped it around Clara's shoulders and over the baby's small body. The prairie wind had turned cooler as afternoon slipped toward evening, and the coat swallowed them both in warmth. "You'll need that more'n I do," he said quietly. Clara's eyes filled sudden with tears she'd been too strong to shed. "Why would you help us?" she asked. Wade looked out at the open land, jaw tight. "Because once upon a time," he said slow, "someone didn't help when they could have." He didn't say more, but the ghost in his voice told its own story. He built them a small fire from dry brush, boiled water in his dented tin, and softened the bread enough so Clara could eat and find strength. He rode to a nearby creek at dusk, filled his canteen twice over, and returned before dark settled thick and dangerous. Coyotes howled far off, but none came close to the firelight. Through the night, Wade kept watch, while Clara and the baby slept wrapped in his coat. He listened to the steady rhythm of the child's breath and felt something shift deep inside him, something that had been buried under miles of dust and regret. By dawn he had made up his mind. He would not ride off and leave them to fate. The frontier was cruel to the weak, and Clara and her son had already tasted too much of that cruelty. When she woke, she found him saddling Rusty. Fear flickered again. "You leaving?" she asked. Wade shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm taking you to Briar Creek. There's a church there, and folks who still remember what kindness means. It's a hard ride, but it's better than dying in the grass." Clara pressed the baby close, hope trembling fragile in her chest. And so, under the wide and watchful sky of the Wild West, a drifter who owed the world nothing chose to change its course for a woman and her hungry child. The ride to Briar Creek tested all three of them, and maybe even the horse besides. Clara rode behind Wade, clutching baby Caleb tight. The cowboy's coat still wrapped around them like a promise stitched in wool. The prairie did not soften its edges just because mercy had taken root. The sun beat down merciless by noon, and a dry wind kicked dust into their eyes until every blink burned. More than once, Wade scanned the horizon and spotted riders in the far distance, men who didn't. Looked like farmers or traders, and each time he steered, Rusty off the main trail, taking the longer path through scrub and shallow ravines. Clara noticed the way his hand hovered near his revolver, the way his posture changed when danger might be near. "You expecting trouble?" she asked once, voice low. Wade gave a humorless half-smile. "Trouble's like a stray dog out here. If it smells weakness, it follows." They made camp near a rocky outcrop the second night, and as Caleb fussed from the long ride, Wade surprised Clara by whittling a small piece of wood from a fallen branch. His fingers, rough as saddle leather, shaped it careful into a tiny horse. When he handed it over, Caleb's small hands grabbed it instinctively, and for the first time since Clara's wagon had broken down, the baby let out a sound that wasn't a cry, but something close to a giggle. The sound hung in the air like a miracle. Clara looked at Wade with a softness that hadn't been there before. "You got children?" she asked gently. The firelight flickered across his face, showing scars she hadn't noticed in daylight. He stared into the flames a long moment. "Had a wife," he said finally. "Had a little girl. Fever took 'em both one winter while I was driving cattle north. By the time I got back, there weren't nothing left to fix." His jaw tightened, but his voice didn't break. It had broken long ago and healed crooked. "I reckon I've been riding ever since, trying to outrun that empty house." Clara reached out without thinking and touched his sleeve. "You ain't outrunning it," she said soft. "You're riding straight through it." He didn't answer, but something eased in his eyes. The next afternoon, as Briar Creek's church steeple finally cut a thin line against the sky, trouble did find them. 3 riders broke from behind a cluster of mesquite trees, bandanas high over their faces, rifles glinting mean in the sun. "Well now," one called out, "ain't this a sweet picture? Hand over the horse and whatever else you're carrying, and maybe we let you keep breathing." Clara's grip tightened in panic, and Caleb began to cry again, sharp and frightened. Wade slid from the saddle slow and deliberate, placing himself between the riders and the woman behind him. He no longer wore his coat. He stood in a simple shirt, sleeves rolled, dust streaking his skin, but there was steel in his posture. "There ain't nothing here worth your trouble," he said evenly. "Move along," the leader laughed. "Looks to me like that horse is worth plenty." Wade's eyes flicked once toward Clara, then back. "You don't want this," he warned. But some men only understand one language. The first shot cracked the air like thunder. Rusty reared, Clara screamed, and Caleb's cry cut through it all. Wade moved faster than thought, drawing his revolver with a precision born from years he wished he could forget. 2 shots rang out clean and sharp. One bandit tumbled from his saddle. The others wheeled in shock. Another fired wild, grazing Wade's shoulder, but the cowboy didn't flinch. His 3rd shot shattered the courage of the last 2, and they fled in a cloud of dust, leaving silence heavy behind them. Wade swayed once the danger passed, blood darkening his sleeve. Clara scrambled down, terror giving way to fierce resolve. "You're hurt," she cried. He glanced at the wound, unimpressed. Just a scratch, but he sank to one knee anyway. Clara tore a strip from her already ruined dress and bound his shoulder tight, hands steady despite her fear. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Wade looked past her to the baby, who had gone quiet again, clutching the small wooden horse. "Yeah," he said softly. "I did." They reached Briar Creek by sundown. The church bell ringing faint and warm. Folks came running when they saw the blood and the weary travelers. The preacher, An older man with kind eyes listened to Clara's story and placed a firm hand on Wade's good shoulder. "Son," he said, "there's work here if you're willing, and maybe a place to hang that hat for good." Wade looked at the small town, the simple houses, the lanterns glowing hopeful in the coming dark, and then at Clara and Caleb. The baby reached out a tiny hand toward him, fingers curling around nothing but air. For the first time in years, Wade didn't see the road stretching endless before him. He saw a door. He saw a chance. He nodded once. "Reckon I could stay a spell." Months later, the prairie grass still whispered in the wind, but this time it carried laughter instead of hunger. Clara worked in the town's boarding house. Caleb grew strong and bright-eyed, and Wade built fences, fixed roofs, and slowly let the ghosts loosen their grip. He never asked for thanks, never spoke much of that day in the tall grass, but everyone in Briar Creek knew that sometimes fate turns not on grand battles or piles of gold, but on a single coat laid over a shivering child. And as the sun set crimson over the Wild West horizon, Wade Callahan finally understood that he hadn't just saved a mother and her baby that day. He had saved what was left of his own soul, and from that day forward, the cry of a hungry child in the prairie grass became the very sound that brought a lone drifter home.